Okay, so hope you've got that sheet in front of you, which should give most of the Proverbs that we're going to look at this morning. I've loved going through Proverbs. Proverbs is an incredibly practical book. Last week, as we looked at it, we were able to look at a selection of Proverbs that speak very much to our own hearts and our own anxieties. And if you remember last week, we looked at to see how Jesus is actually able to strip anxiety of all of its power. That was last week. This week, the Proverbs we're looking at speak to our hands, our feet, our time, our wallets, our diaries. And they give us a huge challenge as to who we are as individuals and also who we are as a church, so that when we go out beyond the doors, people get to know more about us. It's about how we serve those around us. And one of the canvases which we've got around our room actually speaks to this subject. It's that one over there. It's going to appear on the screen if you can't see it. But it says, belong. Belong to your church and your community. And what we're thinking about this morning is to ask the really serious question that, is that just a pretty canvas on the wall with a very artistic picture of Hadleigh High Street? Or is it something more? Does it reflect something of who we are and what we're about? And so the Proverbs we're looking at this morning are all about getting us to think about how we relate to the poor, the marginalised, the disadvantaged, those whose life just hasn't gone right, wherever they might be. And it's to get us to think about how we might respond to them. How we might respond to them. And what the Proverbs say to us is very pointed, very clear, and it should be challenging. So the first one, which is on the screen there, 21 verse 3. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Another one slightly further down, 31 verses 8 and 9. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Now, just looking at those verses, they should make us stop and think. They should make us think and remind us that mere religious observance means very little to God if it's not accompanied by some kind of good action towards those in society who need help, lifting up or defending. And it's a thread which runs all the way through the Bible, that God's people are to look out for those who are less fortunate than them. That's what we're thinking about this morning. How do we relate to the world around us and to those whose lives just are difficult? But before we start thinking about that, we need to do some groundwork. We need to do some stuff before that. So what's the basis for this kind of action? Why should we help alcoholics in Liverpool? Why should we help people who were once drug addicts in Ipswich? Why should we do that sort of thing? And we're going to do that by going back to chapter 3. So we're back there on the sheet. It's something we looked at a while ago, but we didn't draw this part out of it. So if you remember, the book of Proverbs is written from the perspective of a father giving advice to his son on how he is to live and why he is to live a certain way. And so for most of the first 9 chapters, the image is this. The dad is saying to the young man, pursue wisdom as if it is a woman, as if she's a woman that you want to spend the rest of your life with. It's kind of getting him to think about who is his most close, intimate relationship going to be with. Just like a wife shapes a husband, because they do, wisdom is going to shape the young man. And so this helps us get some of what is said. So verse 13 will say, blessed are those who find wisdom, those who gain understanding, for she is more profitable than silver and yields better return than gold. She is more precious than rubies. Nothing you desire compares with her. And then that verse that's up on the screen. Her ways are pleasant and all her paths are peace. She's a tree of life to those who take hold of her. Those who hold her fast will be blessed. Now I want you to focus in on verse 17, that one that's up on the screen. All her paths are peace. Now that is actually deeply significant, especially when we think about how wisdom is spoken of in other parts of the book. And I want to show you why. When we think about peace, that word peace that's up on the screen there, we might think of it in ways which just aren't quite as rich as the Bible would say. So we might think of peace as being the absence of something. So the absence of noise, the absence of work, the absence of responsibility, the absence of toddlers. That might be peace for us. Whereas the Bible, peace is a much richer, deeper concept. Peace means to flourish in every conceivable way. It's not merely the absence of things which wind you up. It's a positive concept about all of life being as full as it can possibly be. So work being full, relationships being full, society being full. So if a nation had peace, in terms of what the Bible says, it would be an incredible thing. It would be to flourish in every conceivable way. All of society would be working exactly as it should do. So all of wisdom's paths are peace. They're like that. Now read again, slightly further down. Place that thought into verse 19, because verse 19 says this: by wisdom the Lord laid the earth's foundations. And when you put those two things together, what it's saying is this: God has created the universe in such a way that it was designed to flourish, that it wasn't just put together the way I might put together a kitchen. It wasn't just a random collection of stuff. There's a pattern whereby things work. So there's a pattern which, if you follow it, everything flourishes, and if you don't follow it, everything falls apart. Like a recipe when you're baking next week, like a pattern when you're making an item of clothing, the instructions when you put together anything from IKEA. There's a pattern, and if you follow it, it all goes well, and if you deviate from it, it turns into disaster. And so the pattern for how things work is woven into everything in our world. So just like physics, where if you obey the laws of physics, you can make planes fly, there's patterns to relationships and society and family and work. There's a way that things are just meant to work that God has designed. And when things work by the pattern of wisdom that God has set, everything flourishes. People flourishes, creation flourishes. Everything works as it should. And when a society or when a person doesn't follow that pattern, if they drink too much, if they become an addict, then things begin to unravel. That pattern isn't there. So the world gets messed up. That means that as you go through the book of Proverbs, when it tells you not to lie, it's not just a moral thing that it's talking about. It's saying that when you lie, you're causing the world to break down. It's not working as it should do. When wisdom is ignored, it leads to a mess. That's what Proverbs teaches. What it leads to is things like this: poverty, injustice, children being raised without hope, the vulnerable being exploited, alcoholism, drug addicts. And here's the first big challenge that comes. When the Bible talks about righteousness and justice, it's actually saying this, that as a group and as individuals, God's people are commanded not to stand on one side and tut at the world, nor to be immersed in it so they're absolutely indistinguishable, but to make every effort to restore the world to God's original design, so that when the world is unraveling, God's people should be the ones who are there putting it back together again. They should be fixing things. That's what it means to do righteousness and justice. One of the other things that should make Christians stop and think is this: many people in our world don't believe in God, and yet they're passionate about injustice, really passionate. That should challenge us if our passion isn't near theirs. It simply should challenge us. And at the same time, those who are not believers in God, who are passionate about injustice, need to be challenged by the thought, why do you actually care anyway? Because why? Why bother? There is no ought to be without God. There's just stuff that happens. So, righteousness and justice, it goes far beyond our concept of punishing the guilty, pacifying those who've been angered, and compensating victims. It's about putting things back the way that they are supposed to be. That's deeply provocative to how we might think of things. Because what it's saying is this: it's all about generosity. It's all about being generous people. And do you want to know how generous you've got to be? Look down at chapter 3, verses 27 to 28. This is a pair of proverbs that go together, and the second one helps us understand the first one a little bit better. So the hymn in verse 27, that good shouldn't be withheld from that hymn, is the neighbour of verse 28. And you kind of need to read it together. So it says this is what it literally says: don't withhold good that belongs to him when it's in your power to do so. Don't say to your neighbour, go and return, I will give it to you tomorrow when you have it with you. That is saying something which in English we can just obscure. It's saying this: don't withhold any unspecified good, which could mean money, it could mean physical aid, it could mean a tool, it could mean don't withhold anything from your neighbour when they need it and you have the power to give it. It's not that you've borrowed something and they come to collect it. It's saying don't withhold anything from someone who needs it, because this is the shocking part. It's saying they have a right to it. It's saying it's their right. It's driving home that wise people are attentive to their community, and when they see a need, they just know that they are obligated to help, particularly those who are really close around them. Wise people are obligated to help. It's really, really pointed. It's not saying whether you think the person deserves it or not. It's telling you if you see someone in need and you can do something about it, you owe them. That's what it literally says. And on Wednesday, I guess those of you who were here at the India night, which is why the decorations are still up, by the way, if you were confused, got to hear something more about that. I wasn't here, but I'm going to guess that you heard about how the work in India is changing that country, or dreams to change that country, by changing the lives of children one at a time and giving them hope. For that particular mission, helping the poor is not an optional extra that they add on to evangelism. It's an integral part of their work. So there's work among orphans where they are given hope and they're given a future back. That's a picture I took off their website. That's one of the orphanages. Now, if that project did not exist, the prospect for those particular children up on the screen right now would be bleak. They would be illiterate. They would be unhealthy. It's very likely they'd be drawn into crime and drawn into prostitution. Whatever potential they had, whatever gifts they had, whatever ability was there, it would never be realised. They would have become people, they could become people who might shape their nation. Without that orphanage, they might be languishing in prison. They might be trapped in the sex trade. They might be lying in an unmarked grave. And if we try and work out why that orphanage has to exist, so why does that orphanage have to exist in India? We might say, well, it's because of the country. It's just the way that the country's structured. It's an evil system and they're just victims of it. That's what we might say. Or we might go to the other end and say the parents are to blame. They're not looking after their children. They shouldn't have had so many children. We might go there. And there might be some truth in both of those opinions. But none of us are ever going to say that it's the kids' fault. None of us are ever going to say it's those children's fault that that orphanage has to exist. Why? Because it's just simply the circumstances they were born into. And the truth of the matter is this: there but for the grace of God go every single one of us. We could quite easily have been born into one of those families. That could have been you. What does the Bible teach us? If you can see a need and you can fix it, you're obligated to help. In the words of the Spider-Man films, with great power comes great responsibility. If you remember nothing else, remember that. Proverbs teaches that there is a way the world is supposed to work where people flourish, and wise people, God's people, are to be engaged in helping them flourish and restoring the world as best as they can. So if you have resources, if a church has resources, and it doesn't share them, in God's eyes, that's injustice. If you don't share, it's injustice. So it falls very much into the realm of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Yesterday, it was Luke's stag do, and we almost had a living version of the parable of the Good Samaritan. So Paul was driving the bus, I was following in my car, and as Paul was driving down one road, a lady fell off her bike right in front of us. So in the minibus, there was a pastor. In the car, just behind, there was another pastor. And to their credit, in the front one, they did ask if she was okay. In our one, I just said, no, they've checked, it's fine, let's carry on. It was... And yeah, so I was like the one who was prepared to pass by, and Mr. Bus corrected me on that. And Yeah. But the parable of the Good Samaritan is that if you see someone lying in the road who's been done over and left for dead and ignored by the religious in their car, helping the needy in that situation doesn't fall into the realm of a choice. It's something you're simply supposed to do. So the priest and the Levite who walked by, they were obligated to help. I think we can all probably agree with that. They owed help to the man lying left for dead in the sun. They needed to restore him because the world had dealt him a blow, and they simply needed to lift him up. And the point is this, that's applicable to us. We might not see someone lying in the road, we did yesterday, but if there's a pensioner on our street who's evidently struggling to keep her garden tidy, we might cut her lawn for her and do some errands for her. That's something we could do. If there's a family who've been abandoned by the father, we might seek to reduce the pressure on them by buying them some groceries or helping out with their kids. If there are things in our society which inherently disadvantage certain people, simply because of the circumstances they were born into, we're called to lift them out of them if we can. So going back to chapter 21, verse 3, there are two terms there, righteousness and justice. These are two sides of the same coin. So justice, that's the reactive thing. If you see the problem, you step in and you fix it. It's kind of the crisis situation. So if you lived in an area where it flooded regularly, it would be in a moment of crisis delivering sandbags, delivering food, protecting people from the flood which was coming in. That's the justice side. Righteousness, that's something different. That's proactive. It's saying that if you lived in an area where it flooded regularly, you'd be the person who's saying, let's build a dam. Let's protect these people from a world which could destroy them. One person commenting on that verse said this, if everyone did righteousness, there would be no need to do justice. If everyone was proactive, there would be no need to be reactive. And we're called to be those types of people in our workplaces, in our neighbourhoods, in our communities. One of the other Proverbs, chapter 29, verse 7. A righteous man knows the rights of the poor. A wicked man does not understand such knowledge. When it says there that a righteous man knows the rights of the poor, it's not just saying he's got some factual knowledge about it. It's not saying that I know what should happen for them. It's knowing in the sense that Adam knew his wife and she bore him a son. It's an active, experience-filled, passion-fueled knowing. It's a knowing that takes action. That's what it's saying to us. A righteous person knows and takes action for the poor. And it's serving God. Because it could be, as I've been talking about this so far, objections have come up in your mind. I've heard quite a few of these in my time. That we're not called to fix things, we're just called to share the gospel. And yeah, it's partly true, we are called to share the gospel, but actually we're called to do more than that. If that's where you've gone in your mind, I just want to show you some of the other Proverbs. So, chapter 19, verse 17. Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. So, generous to the poor, you lend to God. Chapter 14, verse 31, which is up on the screen. Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker. Insults his maker. But he who is generous to the needy honours his maker. Chapter 22, verse 2. The rich and poor meet together, and the Lord is maker of all. There's a film, I've seen it, but I can't remember who's in it or what the title is, where an adult takes a handkerchief out of their pocket and wipes the face of a filthy boy and utters these words, there's a child under here somewhere. If you follow Jesus, it's much more valuable than that. Every child that's taken from the gutter in India, every old person that's cared for in the community, every act of kindness to restore a broken world, over that can be spoken, under this poverty, under this illness, is someone who reflects the image of God. It's to help God When you help someone, you can say this: I do this to serve God. And in fact, Matthew 25 would take it even more pointedly than that. Jesus goes as far to say that to help the poor is to help him. Read that passage at some time, Matthew 25. Generosity is actually evidence that we are who we claim to be. The book of James would say to us, if you see someone in need and you say, go, be warm, be well fed, and you do nothing, then he'd question whether the love of God is in you. He would say it that starkly. So if we are people who say it's just about sharing the gospel, we're not supposed to help anyone, it's as if we imagined ourselves in the parable of the Good Samaritan. We see the guy lying in the road, and our response is to give him a tract. That's what it would be doing. It would be to give him a tract and then move on. Now, that just instinctively doesn't work, does it? Instinctively, we know that's not going to work. To be generous is to serve God. To save the disadvantaged is to serve God. But there is something connected with the gospel in doing this. When you seek to bless those in your community who are in need, when you seek to transform it into more of what it should be, it opens doors for the gospel. It makes people more receptive to the message. So, chapter 11, verse 10. When it goes well with the righteous, the city rejoices. When God's people do this kind of stuff, this verse is saying the rest of the city, the rest of the people respond positively. They are impressed. They see it and it impresses them. They can clearly see who God's people are, and it's as if they rejoice. Those sort of people are more likely to respond to our gospel messages. If they've seen us do something, they're more likely to listen to our words. And scanning over the book of Acts, you see this. So I read some verses earlier on from Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, verse 45. What's it? It's talking about the very first church that exists. They sell their property and give to anyone who's in need. Not just Christians, they'll give to anyone who's in need. Verse 47. They enjoy the favour of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. There might be a connection between those two, between the giving stuff and having favour from the people. They're probably connected. Imagine for a moment the most eloquent preacher in the world. That's not me. Who every single Sunday delivers a beautiful, heartwarming message to the church who are there. But then after the service, you hear him putting down his wife and verbally abusing her every single day. When that happens, his well-crafted messages begin to lose their power. It's the same with the church. Imagine, on the other hand then, a more mediocre speaker. However, his character, his humility, and his life are all exemplary. Then, despite how rubbish he might be at speaking, people will hang on his every word because they see that his life is so much better. And so in the same way, if a community perceives that a church exists just for itself and just for the people who come along, then no matter how great the preaching, no matter how great the events they put on, it will not resonate with people outside. It just won't do it. But if a community sees a church who love their community and surprise them with acts of kindness, they're going to be more open to the message. They're going to be more open. The acts are done out of love, but they lay the foundation for evangelism. So, I just want to challenge us as a church. Why don't we think about this subject a little bit more? Part of our vision for this year, the 200th year of the church, is this: to seek to help our community flourish in every conceivable way. So if you were at the Vision Meet evening in January, that's one of the things we said. We want to serve the people who are outside the doors of this church. We want to love Hadleigh, to put it another way. So I want to encourage you to be thinking of ways that we can astound the community with acts of kindness. What could we do for the people who don't come here? And personally, be thinking about your workplace. How can you surprise someone who needs help? Think of your street. Who needs some help there? What could you do which is going to make a difference to those around you? Who are the people that God might be putting on your heart and saying, I really need to bless that person, that family, that situation? Where is there a crisis that you or the church can help with? Be thinking about these things, do be bringing them to our attention. And at the same time, think a bit more long term as well. In the past, we've discussed food banks. Maybe we need to revisit that. How could we get involved? The money management course that we do, let people know about it because it's great. It helps them build a dam in their lives. In response to Proverbs, these are some of the things that we need to think about. Who do you need to be looking out for? Well, the Bible gives you some clues. The widows, sick, fatherless, poor. You can probably think of some other groups of people. Look for those people and see how you can bless them. If you've had your community news through this week, you'll see that on the front page it says that unsung heroes have been recognised, which to me means they're not unsung heroes anymore, but that's just how my brain works. But I want to encourage you to read that article and to begin to dream that next year, not that Hadleigh Baptist Church would be on the front page of the community news, but we might be unsung heroes in our community. That people might be seen as those who make a difference to the world around them. From the crisis moment to changing the atmosphere of the community. Where we do serve already, I want to say keep going, especially the things that you do silently. I know there's probably loads of you out there who do things that I never get to hear about. I want to say keep doing them and keep doing more. When we think about the work that we support in India, which we support financially, we're changing lives on the other side of the world. The challenge is, what about here? Maybe we could commit to pray for India more fervently and think about what we could do here a little bit more. And just in closing, I want to talk about motivation for doing all of this stuff. Because I'm going to be honest, when I watch things like Children in Need, when I watch Comic Relief and things like that, the needs can be so big, and the calls that they give to do things, they can seem like they're just trying to provoke guilt so that you give money. Guilt never changes you. Guilt never motivates you. If you're provoked into action by guilt, eventually the person who you're trying to help change their life but just won't actually change begins to feel like a black hole who just sucks up your time, your life, and your resources. Instead of being inspired by guilt, you need to be inspired by grace. You need to see how God has treated you. Grace will always inspire you far much more than guilt. Because from God's perspective, he could say about every single one of us in this room, you are a black hole to his resources. You cost him his son to save. His ongoing work of the Spirit within you, you still resist and you quench him. You still mess up, and yet God never, ever gives up. Jesus became poor. He suffered injustice. The image of God in him was broken so we might be restored. Seeing how Jesus saved you is the only thing that's going to make you passionate to change the world around you. It's the thing. You cost him his son, and yet he still loves you. So if you struggle to look outside the doors of church and actually want to help people, look to see what God has done for you first. That's where you start. Don't go for guilt. Look at what Jesus has done from you. And how much the life of Jesus permeates your soul and my soul and the soul of this church will determine what you do and in what attitude you do it. So, as we go from here today, I want to encourage you to do something. Respond to God's grace. Do everything in his name and for his glory. When you do stuff in the community to make Hadleigh flourish, be thinking about grace. Lift the hurting out of the gutter. Serve Jesus by serving those who bear his image. Be an unsung hero in your street. And make the ground more fertile for the gospel. Because God calls us to be people who don't just give him sacrifices on a Sunday, but change the world that we live in. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we want to thank you first of all that you don't see us as black holes which take up all of your time and all of your resources and all of your power. But instead, full of love and full of grace, you are utterly committed to making us all that we can be. You transform us from sinful people into people who are ever more like you. And we would ask that as we look at the community around us, our hearts might resonate with yours. So show us things that we can help with. Show us those people who are in a crisis, who need to be lifted up and have the image of God dusted down again. Show us those people. Show us those situations in our world which need to have dams built to protect people from the disaster which might sweep them away. Help us to do righteousness and justice, not to prove ourselves to you, but in response to who you are and what you've done for us. We would ask that you would help us to be an unsung hero. People who do things, not because we might one day appear on the front page of a magazine, but because one day you might say to us, well done, good and faithful servant. And we ask this in your name. Amen.